He looked up at the mountain. It had a snow topping tonight, and the moon cast a warm light on it. There's no prettier sight, he thought, and no prettier place than this one. It traps a man into staying, into building here. Then it shows him that he doesn't even possess his own cabin and fields. The valley is its own, he knew now. The valley and the beasts and the mountain and the snows and the water and the cliffs owned themselves yet. If he left here, in a few years there would be little sign that he had even come. The vines would cover the buildings and pull them down. They would pull over even the tombstone here at Amy's grave. The trees would spring up in the fields and gnarl again with roots the yielding land. The clearing he had made on the hill would become again part of the whole, as the bear had been part of the whole, and now in its grave was part of the whole, unprotestingly. Hey everybody, thank you so much for watching Leaf by Leaf. Today I'm talking about John Ehle's The Landbreakers, which is a work of historical fiction and naturalism and is extraordinary. But first off, I want to point out that I even discovered this book because I was invited to be a guest on the Unburied Books podcast back in June. I've got a link to the episode in the description. You can go there to hear more thoughts on this incredible book than I'll cover in this video. But you'll also just want to subscribe and start listening to Unburied Books in general because Kasia and Dylan are astute, articulate readers with a contagious passion for great literature. Join them as they navigate through the treasures in the illustrious NYRB Classics series. The Landbreakers is not my typical read. I don't read a lot of historical fiction, and I certainly haven't read many books from specifically North Carolinian authors about North Carolina. I've read Charles Frazier's Cold Mountain, which has similarities to this book, kind of in that same category, and of course Thomas Wolfe. Look, Homeward Angel is one of my favorite American novels. So, not my typical thing that I gravitate toward, but I'm extremely thankful because this is one of those books that has a really peculiar effect on me. It made me homesick and nostalgic for a life that I've never known. Perhaps it's sort of in the way that some people talk about feeling that same kind of way when they stare out at the ocean. So perhaps for Americans, there's some latent recognition of our roots, even though now we weren't there, of course. Just as there's tragic blood in our land, so too there seems to be land in our blood. So on the one hand, reading books like these really shows you just how difficult and harsh and brutal life was for everybody back then. But at the same time, given where we all are now, it shows how resilient the human spirit is. Still, it's a powerful, powerful book. It is the furious heartbeat of a newborn raging against the harsh suddenness of an unwelcoming world. It took me about a week to read it, but I felt as if I had lived through all 5 of its years, and those years that it covers are 1779 through 1784, very significant American years, starting just after the 1776 Revolution and independence. But of course, nothing comes to a halt right on a date that we say something happened. But before I get too far into the book, let me talk just a little bit about John Ehle, because despite having lived in North Carolina for the last 20 years, I did not know about John Ehle. He was born in Asheville, North Carolina, about 2 hours from me to the west, and he died in Winston-Salem, about 15 minutes from me to the west, and somewhere that I go all the time. He was the co-founder of the North Carolina School of the Arts, and he taught at UNC Chapel Hill for many years. When he died, Lauren Whitaker wrote, "The School of the Arts was born in the 1960s out of John Ehle's clear vision and tenacious advocacy, thus the mindset of someone who endeavors to birth a new community was something for which Ehle had firsthand experience." His disposition, I think, is further sharpened by his remarks when he received an honorary doctorate in 1981, when he said, "The only freedom any of us ever has is the freedom to accept or create his own form of bondage." So, in other words, we are all going to be slaves to something. So, make it something that's both worthwhile and of your own choosing. Critical reception of his work, which went all the way to the New York Times, notes that he's the most important chronicler of life in Appalachia. He is eloquent without moralizing. He provides a psychological depth and even a dignity to peoples who are normally marginalized and disparaged. And his work anticipates that of Cormac McCarthy, among others. The Landbreakers is the first of 7 books in his Mountain series, which covers the early days right after the American Revolution, like I said, all the way to the Great Depression era in the early 20th century. There's a lot going on in the background of this novel, not least of which is, a nation being born out of a bloody revolution against Britain and constant warring with natives. But like I said, Ehle keeps these sort of in the background, and they're only referenced obliquely. The characters in this book have specifically struck out to establish a world outside of the nation, even though it is, of course, pressing deeper into the interior of the nation. But it's interesting because these characters have a different idea of what they want life to be, different from the rest of the nation, especially back in places like Philadelphia. They don't want to be caught up in the rigors of city life. They're looking for something simpler. And it all starts with a young couple who make their way into an unsettled part of the western North Carolina mountains, and they begin the very hard scrabble life it takes just to survive day to day. Over time, of course, then other settlers make their way into the land and a community begins to form. Naturalism, like I said, and fate loom over this whole novel and run through it as a red thread. They made slow progress and their dream kept getting pared down. This is the reality. We are set in the world, Nicholas thought. We are set not adrift as on a sea, for the sea supports whatever floats on it. We are adrift in the air and move like dried leaves whisked about, subject any moment to falling to the ground, to age-olding, to the open grave, or leaf molding. There's nothing proper about starting a country. Anything having to do with a birthing is bloody. A birthing pains. Even getting a homestead starting pains, for nature doesn't allow births without suffering. And yet it is again a lot about birthing of a community. And even though there's pain, it's still that drive to assemble. It was not that the family was making a machine they could use. The family was the machine. The family and the clearing and the crops and the stock and the tools were part of the same thing. The family and the place were the same thing and could not be separated one from the other. One could not understand the family without knowing about the land and their work on it and plans for it. And one could not know the land without any real understanding, without knowing this family of people. They were dusty with the land. The grit of the land was in them. Their work, which was done together, was the chief meaning of their family lives. And so it is again just such a truth that toil, pain, hard work brings people together. Ehle also captures these incredible details. For example, he had heard it said that a church should not be set under a nut tree, for the falling of nuts would disrupt the service. So just thinking about the mindset back then, and it shows again how Ehle was not just a great creative writer and novelist, but also an adept historian, someone who could get in there and get immersed in the world of the time to where a detail like that could surface. That would be something that people back then would think about. Where to build a church such that, certain trees around with certain nuts that grow on them won't fall and hit the roof and distract during the services. Or another detail is when they need to move their livestock from where they are there in the mountains down into a community in the foothills so that they can sell and trade and bring supplies much needed back up to their community. We get this. We need cold weather. The stock won't lose so much weight then, and the rivers are not so high in the fall. These kinds of details are amazing because you see that these characters, from trial and error, of course, and from conventional wisdom being passed down, they've learned that, oh, wait a minute, we need to keep our stock fattened so that it'll sell for a greater price or sell at all. But in warmer weather, they're going to sweat more or whatever. I don't know if all animals sweat, but they'll lose weight faster. And they're thinking about the rivers that they have to ford with the livestock. The rivers won't be so high as well in cold weather. These are the details that just really bring this world to life for us now. I can't in words describe to you how well Ehle does characters and their interpersonal dynamics. In one way, you could almost refer to this as a soap opera, but without the over-the-top dramatics. But even if she had to go live there, he wouldn't dare touch her. She'd cut his head off with a knife if he came round her. She'd trump him silly. He'd think he'd got hold of a wildcat that had been eating green berries. I wish we'd go to Morganton and get shit of these mountains entirely, she said. I'd like to have people around to talk to and a place to go to worship. No, he said deeply. I can't go down there. It's all finished there. They've got their answers. But this is new. I've got to be where there's the start of things. How many kinds of love are there, she said. Oh, he said, there's kinds I don't know. I love you so much, and I love Felix, and I love Grover, and I love my sisters, and I love Charlie. But there ever one a different love. Maybe love is like collecting things, like collecting colored rocks to put at the bottom of a spring. It might be. I wouldn't be surprised, he said. So in just a few lines, and especially in dialogue, Ehle captures the totality of each person and brings them to life such that when something happens over here, you know exactly how all of the other characters are reacting, how they're thinking in that moment. Sort of like when you watch The Office and the characters and their personalities and everything about them is so perfectly drawn for us that we know how everybody's going to react to anything any one of them could do. And I mean, all this stuff together, the eye for details, the characterization, the setting, On top of all of this, in the narrative voice, which doesn't take diction and vernacular on like the dialogue, shows us that Ehle is just a great writer. They gathered leaves for the bed. They carried in firewood and stacked it in one corner. He closed the door and propped it shut. She laid a fire, and he brought his flint and powder and lit it. The fire caught and began to crackle. "Look a there," she said. He turned with her and saw the reflection of the fire on the new logs and on the moist, cold clay around the stones on the hearth, and on the unsmoked stones of the hearth on which the fire lay. They were standing in the center of a glistening womb which they had made. And even in just one sentence, he can capture an intense, powerful feeling. One short sentence. This is what the narrator says when they have gotten everything ready and they're leaving most of the women behind, and all the men and a couple of the women and all of the livestock are now being set out on this sort of pernicious journey down into the foothills to go to the market, like I was talking about earlier. And it says, "From the shadow of the mountain moved now the valley's strength and wealth." And so that also gives you the sense of sort of foreboding for those who are going to stay behind in the valley too, when the strength and wealth of the entire community is now departing. It's mobile. It's subject to the wilds of the journey. So in the end, like I've been saying, Ehle creates these incredibly rounded, full, psychologically deep and rich characters. But he also manages to subtly shift how we feel about many of them over time, as they themselves are molded and changed by their environment. He has such a prowess for drama. There are incredibly intense, dramatic scenes of jealousy, greed, but also bravery and sacrifice that are just emotionally complex and really deeply moving, and very often morally complicated. For those who have read the book, I'm thinking of Harrison's destroying of the letter that Lacey sent to Lori, and of course, the most dramatic scene and dramatic sacrifice, I think, of the whole story, Lacey's decision that he makes towards the end of the big bear hunt. These two things are drawn with such vividness, such richness, but also such complication that you'll chew on them for a great while. And you'll find that the either or, black and white, right or wrong mindset with which we sort of knee-jerkingly want to organize our world breaks down when applying it to and evaluating these types of situations. So in The Landbreakers, we readers are made witnesses to birthings on many levels, from the birthing of a child to the birthing of a family to the birthing of a community, and then again, like I said, sort of obliquely, the birthing of an entire nation. Perhaps the only thing more impressive than the novel qua novel is that Ehle has taken on such sensitive historical material and managed to make a book that I would unhesitatingly recommend to any and everyone.